Everyone, good morning, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for the latest in the IAB Southeast Asia and India Revolve webinar series. I'm Laura Greeley, Regional VP, and this week we turn our attention to programmatic revenues across the region. I think we can all agree we are operating in a world that looks very different today than it did a few months ago. One of the most common questions that I receive is how has the global downturn impacted the APAC market? And then what should publishers be doing to evaluate how they can maximize their monetization potential during these times? We're joined today by Emily Yuri, Marketing Director of APAC of PubMatic, who's based here in Singapore, and Susan Wu, the Director of Marketing Research at PubMatic. Susan is joining us from New York this morning, so thank you for taking time out of your evening. We're delighted to have you. Together, they will be sharing with us trends they are seeing within APAC, what categories are recovering faster, and also how is this region comparing to other markets. This is an interactive session. Please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function at the side of your screens. Please join me in welcoming both Emily and Susan. And Emily, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Laura introduced us, Sue and I are going to be taking you through some trends that we have that we've looked into for the first time in APAC. Sue, can you move on to the next slide? Maybe, yeah, there we go. All right, lovely. So just a very quick introduction into who PubMatic are. So we are a global SSP. We help publishers and advertisers across the globe deliver ROI on their advertising campaigns and help drive monetization for publishers. So we've got a global team of over 500 employees in, so can you go on to the next slide? Can we go on to the next slide, please? Lovely, thank you. So there we are. We are in 13 offices across the world, and we have 9 data centers. We analyze a huge amount of data every single day, and actually it amounts to about 15 trillion global advertiser bids on a monthly basis, which gives us a little bit of a snapshot into advertiser trends. So for the first time, so you guys probably will be familiar with some of you may be familiar with our fortnightly COVID updates that we've been producing, and these look at kind of global trends, ad spend trends that have been impacted by COVID. So for the first time, we have dived a little further into the data and pulled out some APAC trends. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sue to take you through them.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here, everyone. So as Emily mentioned, that this is really an extension of the bi-weekly research that we've been putting out in the market, just really tracking the global ad spend trends and how it's impacting each individual market and each category, formats, and channels. For the first time, we're looking at or really releasing data on how it's impacting the APAC market. So today I thought we'd talk a little bit about that, but also how the pandemic has essentially changed the advertising landscape. And some of it is, a temporary change, and some are probably more permanent. And then what the road to recovery looks like. There are definitely pockets of recovery that are happening. So what does that look like? What are folks doing to help optimize their strategies? And then we'll close up the session by looking at some best practices. How should you optimize your monetization strategy during uncertain times like these? So let's dive right in. This data set that you see in front of you is actually from Zenith, and what you could see that probably jumps up at you is that the pandemic has essentially benefited the digital ecosystem since the quarantines have cut out traditional in-person ads like out of home, print, radio, which has been declining on a global scale, as well as linear traditional TV, right? Because basically live events have vanished. This forecast estimate that in 2021, digital advertising will actually grow 2% over this year. And it will take an even larger share of total media, right? Because all the traditional channels are contracting, and then digital is continuing to increase. So today, about half of the global media ad spend is now digital. This is the same for the APAC. It's the same average in APAC. However, in Southeast Asia, only about slightly over a quarter of total media is digital. However, having said that, this is rapidly changing because Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing digital ad spend markets in the world, primarily because there is a falling mobile technology cost and development of faster internet speeds. All of this translates to a rapidly growing mobile population, more traffic, and faster ad rendering, right? So also better user experience with that. When the pandemic started to kind of show itself, the APAC region definitely felt a decline when regional quarantines were in effect. But the biggest impact was really with the global downturn when the pandemic became a global pandemic. And the biggest reason for this is that the world or the world economy is essentially so interlinked, right? We are so globally connected. And so the lowest point of the market, or maybe another way to think about it, is a turning point. It was in April, having contracted almost 50% from its original ad spending in APAC. It's also worth noting that PubMatic's business in China is still nascent, so the timing of the decline is impacted by this. Southeast Asia, if you're looking at this chart in front of you, largely follows the same trends as the rest of the region. But the effects are actually a little bit more temperate. So the decline was less severe, but also the uptick was less dramatic during the recovery period that you see right after the downturn, and then it's been making a steady increase. Through all of this, if you peel back these onion layers, you'll notice that the CPMs, probably not a surprise, CPMs declined through the course of the pandemic due to the increase in traffic, but also lower advertiser demand, right? When you see the pockets of recovery, you also see the return of CPMs, but also that advertiser confidence. So what we're showing here today is that from early March, when the global pandemic essentially started, to the end of this data, which is around mid-June, the APAC market was roughly 18% above its pre-pandemic levels. Southeast Asia was 26% above the pre-pandemic levels, and both of which are above the global average, which was 8% above pre-pandemic levels. Having said that, again, the pandemic is still not behind us. Things are still changing. So, of course, I expect these numbers to continue to change, right? During the recovery, just for comparison, the EMEA market was quite varied, with the Nordics really leading and the rest of the region kind of having ups and downs. And North America was, I would call it a bit of a mixed bag, given that the majority of the spend from North America is coming from the US. So while the overall spend in the US was up, the country lately has another wave of infection and growth across the states, and that's been tampering the recovery efforts. So there are a couple of ways that the pandemic is changing our landscape, right? And some of these, as I mentioned earlier, are temporary in nature. So, potentially it could kind of shift back maybe not all the way, but shift back slightly, and while others are really a behavioral shift, right? So much more permanent and will outlast essentially the pandemic. So across the markets, what we're seeing is that mobile and video is leading the recovery behaviors, especially in the APAC market, and APAC has an advantage here given that it is a very mobile-forward, advanced region. So platform spending for both mobile and video are up against their counterparts, namely this desktop and display that you see here. So let's talk about mobile first. Mobile's increase was primarily driven by the increase in consumer time spent on their devices. But it was also accelerated by the natural progression of consumer usage from desktop to mobile. For video, the ads, interestingly enough, were the first to be cut from advertiser budgets. So it was steeply impacted by the pandemic, likely because video is generally sold at a premium, but brand advertisers were canceling campaigns or having to retool their messaging, right, to reflect the new environment. And there was a lot of anecdotal evidence from analyst reports that branding campaigns were really steeply impacted during this time, while performance campaigns actually performed well during the downturn. And the reason why you see video performing well, a couple of theories is that unlike upfronts, video programmatic selling is dynamic and flexible, right? And there is still that uncertainty around the road to recovery that is driving advertisers to choose more flexible buys. So you see here that video has essentially doubled from its pre-pandemic levels, while display has increased 7%. But both of this, mobile and video, these shifts were happening way before the pandemic. And what the pandemic has essentially done is accelerated these behaviors. The pandemic did not affect all publisher categories equally. So those that are still recovering, you could see here shopping. Some of the biggest declines that we see are within marketplaces within shopping. Part of the reason could be that consumers are going direct to retailers, or that simply there's less ads trying to motivate folks to go into stores. Like there's no more foot traffic, right? Real estate, there were fewer folks touring homes. Health and fitness, gyms were closed. There's probably a decrease in spend from sporting apparel and equipment. And then travel, self-explanatory, still loads of way to go with everyone sheltering in place. Travel became a bit of an obstacle. With the categories that are performing, entertainment has risen, and that's driven a lot by digital streaming services. Business and finance, as you could see, it's a pretty steady incline here. And perhaps that's the interest in knowing how the virus is impacting the state of their economy, their market. And just also to be clear, this is not because that there's an increase in advertiser spending, right? This is really due to the spike, the extraordinary spike in traffic and consumption that's essentially offsetting the spends, right? Education, that's really picked up. Families who are looking for alternatives for perhaps their children to homeschool, alternative to being in school in person, or those who just simply want to pick up a new skill while sheltering at home. And technology, everyone essentially was working from home, so that caused a surge of technology purchases to outfit their home offices. So if you're a publisher and you're thinking about these different categories, obviously capitalize on the leading categories if you're in them, but if you have a foot in some that are recovering, definitely use programmatic tactics, maximize access to unique demand sources, implement header bidding to flatten the waterfall, and stay flexible and nimble. Examine across all of your integrations and all of your ad tech partners to get a handle of your financial impact. So how should we then, given this impact, how should we be thinking about our future and what can we really look forward to? This data set is from eMarketer, and it was a forecast that was done just in July. And essentially, the analysts estimate that the display market, while impacted, still grew 5% over last year. And they expect pretty robust recovery next year with 19% growth year over year. And by 2024, the market will reach a milestone of $300 billion worldwide, almost doubling this year's spend. And APAC is a great position to be because APAC is the second largest display market. It is also predicted to be the second fastest growth after North America. Specifically, eMarketer called out India, where the world's will be the world's fastest growing ad market next year with a 31% growth, and that by 2024 India will claim the seventh largest market, up from I believe 10 in 2021. So thinking kind of more broadly, we just looked at the display estimates, the forecast, where the opportunity could be coming from, but this is data from Magna that focuses on the overall advertising market. And their sentiments basically resonate with the previous forecast that you saw, that APAC is expected to rebound next year in 2021. Obviously, this comes with a big downfall from 2020, and that the ad spend was significantly below their previous expectations due to the impact of COVID-19 and the accompanying economic shutdowns that came to follow. The steepest impact was really on linear ad formats that shrank 16% in the APAC market, and they expect that digital ad formats actually remain flat. So very similar to the previous forecast. All of this data is similar to what we're seeing on our platform, because Magna is also anticipating that APAC's ad spend growth to be driven by specific digital formats. Specifically, there's going to be strong performance from video that's growing 4%, and mobile formats that will grow 6% next year. So it's interesting to see how pubs are reacting tactically during times like these when there's a lot of economic uncertainty. So I thought this was really interesting because essentially from Q4 through Q1 to Q2, publishers continued to adopt header bidding through the pandemic, right? Apologize that this is only US and UK data. There was no APAC data from AdZerk. But I think that this still gives you a sense of what the publisher strategies are during an economic downturn, especially if they are tightening tech investment budgets, right? And also, this data point tells me that publishers recognize the value of header bidding because it allows you to flatten the waterfall and maximize unique demand sources and all of those, programmatic tactics that you could use to maximize or optimize your monetization strategy. So with that, speaking of optimizing your monetization strategy, I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Emily, to talk about those best practices.
Thank you, Sue. Actually, just before I take over, we've had a couple of questions from the audience, so it might be good if we address those quickly because they relate to the data part of this presentation. So I will read them out, and then if we can answer those, and then I'll crack on with my bit. So the first question, I think, was related to slide 11. Where we were looking at the publisher categories that were most steeply affected or otherwise. And the question is, do you see similar patterns for the news category, as there's a lot more inventory available, but spend seems to be diverted?
Yeah, definitely. News is very similar to business and finance in the way that it's been performing. It's been an extraordinary boost and spike in traffic and impressions. And so that has essentially carried the business and carried the news category in terms of ad spending. I believe it is also up, but not as impressively as the ones that I see here. And also varies by, obviously different by region, but APAC, I believe, is also up.
Okay. Hopefully that answered your question. Right, the second question I think relates to slide 15, the forecasts. So the question is, do you foresee the trends potentially changing if we have a second wave?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I think we're all asking within the industry, right? The answer is yes, the trends could potentially change, right? Because this forecast that we see in front of us is based on what we know and the behaviors that were happening at the end of July. So it could potentially, the line could wave around if, things start to pick up in terms of caseloads and advertiser confidence starts to decline. But yeah, it could definitely change. And one of the things is that these forecasts are estimates based on the latest data that we know, right? And there are so many facets to predicting ad spend. There are economic policies, there's, medical restrictions, there's cultural market, all of those things. So it can be really difficult to forecast if potentially what could happen when we don't know where we are with the virus, right?
Okay, thanks, Sue. And one final question that I think relates to the Magna data. Why is it that North America is forecasted to see the smallest decline in advertising in 2020? What has helped it?
Yeah, so what we've seen is that there was like a huge boost in a couple of fronts. Video, I think, was probably lagging behind other regions, but there was a huge boost. And so for the reasons that I mentioned before, with the consumption behaviors, spiking with video and the alignment with mobile, I think that has essentially helped a lot of it. There is also, if we looked at digital media adoption or digital media penetration among all the different regions, North America has the highest penetration. It also is veering off, running a little bit slightly faster than the other regions, so that could also be a reason why the dip is slightly less. Just know that being that North America is also the largest market, this is also a mathematical thing, right? It takes a lot more to plummet the percentage decrease, right?
Great. That seems to be it for questions for now, so we can probably move on. Obviously, if you guys in the audience have any questions, just keep them coming and we can address them at the end. All right, thank you, Sue. So we're now just going to look at a a couple of strategies, or 4 strategies rather, to help publishers optimize programmatic monetization in times of crisis, like we've been through in the last quarter, and in times of recovery, like we're hopefully going into. So broadly, these are maximize demand with header bidding, optimize for the open market, making inventory more attractive for buyers, and maintaining programmatic best practice. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So we're going to start with header bidding. I'm sure many of you are familiar with how header bidding works, but for those of you who need a quick refresher, we'll go through it very, very quickly. So we've got 2 publisher ad server setups here, a traditional waterfall and a header bidding setup. So with the waterfall setup on the left, the opportunity to return a bid or a bid request for an impression is passed sequentially from one SSP to the next. So in this example, the bid request is sent to SSP 1 first, who calls their demand partners. They return a bid of $1.50, which doesn't meet the floor price of $2. The bid request is then passed back to the next SSP, who calls their demand partners and returns a bid of $2.20, which does meet the floor price, and the ad is served. However, in this example, SSPs 3 and 4 were never called, so potential bids of $4.50 and $3 were ignored, which obviously isn't great for the publisher. But in a header bidding setup, the bid request is sent to all SSPs simultaneously, and all returned bids compete in one unified auction, so the highest bid wins. So again, in this example, the $4.50 bid then wins, which is better revenue for publishers, and also the whole process is a lot quicker because there are no passbacks which cause latency. So that's just a whistle-stop tour, and it's a real tongue twister as well. But yeah, if we could move to the next slide, please. But essentially, header bidding brings a lot of advantages for publishers in terms of yield. So having all demand sources compete in one unified auction means that the highest price is achieved for every impression, which obviously means increased revenue for publishers, but it also has some additional benefits. It means that they're not operating on static CPM, so the true value of inventory is reflected, which actually helps publishers in setting floor prices, because if you don't really know what the value of your inventory is, it's very difficult to set prices. And also, we just touched on it, is this issue of no passback, so it really improves latency, which leads to a better user experience for the viewer. So all sorts of benefits there then for header bidding, for publishers in implementing header bidding. The next strategy, broad strategy, is ensuring that you have a solid, you've optimized for the open market. So something that we saw in analyzing the data is that publishers initially saw the biggest hit when the impact of the pandemic hit to PMP and direct revenue. So having a really strong open marketplace offering is important. Partly, and Sue sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, partly because of the flexibility that the open marketplace offers. So as ad spend was contracting, and buyers are a little bit less willing to commit sort of upfront spends, having the flexibility that the open marketplace offers is more attractive. So making sure that you're taking advantage of that is critical, and will continue to be in as we kind of go on into more uncertainty whether the second wave will come or not. So a couple of steps that publishers can take to make sure that they've optimized for the open marketplace. The first is to revisit floor strategy. So pre-pandemic, a floor price that might have made sense if you were, a floor price of $4, for example, if you were regularly getting bids of $5 and $6 and $7, you'd capture all of that. But as CPMs have declined, you need to make sure that you're really looking and examining the types of bids that you're getting and setting floor prices accordingly. And this is particularly important for video. So Sue mentioned that video is kind of leading recovery, and video floors tend to be a little bit higher than obviously display floors. but with a kind of glut of supply because of all this increased consumption that's been happening, you don't want to be missing out on video buyers who might be able to find that inventory cheaper elsewhere. So definitely worth re-examining those. And then once you've re-examined and potentially readjusted your floor prices, it's really important to make sure that you've synergized those across all your integrations. So if you're a publisher with multiple integrations with multiple different supply partners, you want to make sure that you've communicated those floor prices across all of those different supply partners so that you're not missing out on any potential bids. Sorry, I think we're a slide behind. If we could move on to the next slide. Great, thank you. And then kind of almost connected with the previous point is checking ad server prioritization. So, PMP spend is often set at a higher prioritization than open marketplace spend, which probably made sense when more revenue was coming from PMP. But is that still the case? And it's worth examining your ad server and the bids that you're getting, and examining whether it's yielding results. So if you've got one partner bidding $2 on PMP, are they prioritized over a potential $4 bid on the open marketplace? So just re-examining all of that. And then finally, maximizing competition. There are many reasons why publishers might have potentially not wanted to work with supply partners or DSP partners in the past. So it's about re-examining those relationships. Does it now make sense to work with more partners? Does it make sense to add additional wrapper integrations? Could you add more SSPs within each wrapper? All of these steps obviously maximize the number of demand sources that will be potentially competing for your inventory. So a couple of steps there to optimize for the open market. We could move on to the next slide, please. So the next strategy that we'll look at is making inventory more attractive. As we've been talking about all the way through, there has been this huge boost in supply, but paradoxically a decline in demand. So how do you make sure as a publisher that your inventory is as attractive as possible, and how do you make it stand out in the marketplace? So again, there's a couple of easy steps that can be taken here. One is making sure that you're enriching your inventory with data. So as we all know, identity is kind of critically important. So if you're including identity data, this always leads to higher CPMs for each impression. There are loads of identity vendors out there, so potentially consider working with multiple identity vendors to drive increased CPMs and make it easy for buyers to transact on whatever identity solution they want to transact on. And then also, if you're a publisher, and this doesn't apply to all publishers, but to many, if you're a publisher with access to first-party data, make this available to advertisers as data segments, because that definitely enriches campaigns for buyers. And if you can make that available off property as well, then you can potentially earn incremental revenue on those data segments. The next one is get creative with packaging, and particularly for mobile and video. So as advertisers are looking to kind of maximize ROI on their programmatic campaigns, as a publisher, there's an opportunity here to help drive ROI for those advertisers by improving audience addressability or improving contextual relevance. So are there ways that you can be packaging up your inventory to make it more attractive? For example, by layering on first-party data. And again, really important for mobile and video inventory, as these formats are leading the charge for recovery. And there is a buyer preference for transacting on these via deal IDs. Then thirdly, ensuring top-notch viewability. So again, as ad spends decline, buyers are being more careful about how they spend their budgets, and wasted ad spend is, nobody wants wasted ad spend. So metrics like viewability are becoming more and more important. So making sure that you are offering really top-notch viewability to buyers is going to be important. There are formats that you can look at that perhaps you haven't previously used. Those sticky ads can be implemented, which drive 100% viewability, which obviously all buyers love. And then lastly, maximizing delivery rates for video. So again, video's huge driver of recovery. Video tends to drive higher CPMs. So ensuring that you are delivering is obviously critically important. Have you checked that your video player is compatible with the latest VAST or VPAID protocols? What are the timeout settings for loading and redirecting? And are you passing all the right video parameters in your ad requests? So just a couple of steps there. Right, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Lovely, thank you. So the kind of final strategy that we're going to talk about is maintaining programmatic best practice. So this is not something that's unique to the pandemic, and something that really, if you are monetizing programmatically, you should be doing all the time, kind of basic housekeeping, but worth reiterating here. So the first is, again, these are simple steps, but making sure that you've audited your ads.txt and apads.txt files. Have you got your partners properly listed? Because if you haven't, then you are potentially limiting access to your inventory. So making sure that everybody's listed gives buyers more paths to your inventory. Keeping your programmatic pipes clean. So what this means is, by pipes, we mean sort of programmatic supply chains. Working with your tech vendors to identify important parameters that are passed appropriately along the supply chain, and making sure that data is accurate, because sometimes inaccurate data that's passed can actually be more detrimental to monetization than having no data at all. So just making sure that you're on top of that and you're working closely with your partners on that. Related to that is staying sellers.json and supply chain object compliant. So there was a kind of flight towards quality already in effect, but the pandemic has accelerated that. So obviously all buyers are looking for quality, efficiency, transparency in the supply chain. And it's imperative that publishers are kind of embracing and implementing these measures, so that buyers have the visibility that they want, and that they feel like the programmatic supply chain is a safe place to be doing business. And then lastly, and sort of related, is making sure that you're including important mobile app parameters in your ad calls. So we know that the mobile app along with video is going to lead the recovery. And there are a few really important app parameters that should be populated in the ad request. So things like app bundle, app store URL, advertising ID while we still can, the IDFA or the GAID, user, gender, keywords, location, device info. All of that is really, really important to be passing along, so that buyers can make informed decisions about what inventory they're buying. But obviously making sure that you have a consent management platform properly implemented to make sure that you're compliant with user privacy. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Lovely, thank you. So just to summarize all of those, if there are kind of 3 key takeaways for publishers, I would say that these are maximizing demand with header bidding, implementing additional identity solutions and layering on first-party data to make inventory more attractive, and ensuring that mobile and video inventory is also as attractive as possible by passing on, the right parameters in ad requests, making sure that your video delivery rates are on point, and examining different types of formats. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Susan. We do have one more question from our audience that I wanted to get to before we end it today. So the question was, if we add more partners to the wrappers, does that increase latency?
Do you know what? I'm going to have to defer that question. I think it depends on whether it's client side or server side, but I'm going to put my hand up here and say I'm not the most qualified person to answer that question, but if I can get an answer to that question for you.
Awesome. Wonderful. That is no problem. The person who asked it will feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you with the PubMatic team directly. Thank you both so much. There was so much useful information shared here this morning. For those of you who had asked me separately, yes, I'm glad to say that we will be able to share a takeaway of the slides. You will all be receiving a feedback survey invitation, and once you've completed that, we will give you a copy of this so that you can use it in your own businesses. I just wanted to let everyone know about our next upcoming webinar on August 13th. So you might have a slide for that, I'm not sure. We're going to turn our attention to OTT across the region. Gavin Buxton from SpotX is going to take us through the unique characteristics of the Southeast Asian OTT market, how this is different to other markets, particularly Western markets, and then look at some key insights for major markets that impact us here, such as Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. And of course, as we would be asking for looking at some of the trends that are shaping OTT throughout COVID-19. Emily, Sue, I really have to thank you for your time here this morning. It was really, really helpful. And I hope that you'll join us for another session sometime soon. Thank you both and good morning.
Thank you, Laura. It's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to be here.